The asphalt shimmered like a black mirror under the August sun, heat waves rising in lazy spirals that made the painted parking lines look like they were breathing. It was the kind of afternoon where the air itself felt heavy, thick enough to chew, and the only sound cutting through the stillness was the low hum of cicadas and the distant rumble of a refrigeration unit behind the Piggly Wiggly. Sheriff Tom Miller sat in his unmarked beige Dodge Polara, windows down because the air conditioning had given out somewhere around June and he hadn't bothered to fix it. The vinyl seat stuck to the back of his khaki shirt and sweat pooled at the small of his back, but he didn't move. He'd learned patience in Korea, waiting in frozen trenches for movement across snowy ridges. Waiting in 100-degree heat was nothing. He'd pulled into the lot 20 minutes earlier, ostensibly to grab a pack of Camels and a Coca-Cola, but something had caught his eye and held him there. Not something. Someone, the woman. She'd come out of the grocery store's automatic doors, those new pneumatic ones that wheezed like an old man's lungs, carrying 4 brown paper bags stacked so high she had to tilt her head to see around them. Her arms trembled under the weight, the bags cutting red lines into her pale forearms. She wore a floral print dress, the kind housewives bought from the Sears catalog, faded at the shoulders from too many washes. Her hair, pinned up in a careful bouffant that must have taken her an hour that morning, was already wilting in the heat, dark strands plastered to her temple. She was maybe 35, maybe younger. Hard to tell. Some women aged fast out here in the valley, the sun and the worry-carving lines where smooth skin used to be. 10 paces behind her, a man strolled. He didn't carry anything. Sheriff Miller's jaw tightened, the muscle jumping beneath the weathered skin. He reached for his pack of Camels on the dashboard, shook one loose, and lit it with his Zippo without taking his eyes off the scene. The man was tall, well-fed, wearing a short-sleeved button-down that probably cost more than the woman's entire wardrobe. His hair was slicked back with enough pomade to grease an axle, dark sunglasses perched on his nose, despite the fact that the sun was already starting its slow descent. In his right hand, a thick cigar smoldered, the kind you bought at the tobacco shop downtown for $2 apiece. He took long, lazy drags, exhaling plumes of gray smoke that hung in the still air like ghosts. His other hand held nothing. The woman stumbled slightly as she navigated the curb, one of the bags shifting dangerously. A can of something, tomato soup, maybe tumbled out and rolled across the asphalt with a hollow metallic clatter. She stopped, tried to crouch while balancing the other 3 bags, her knees shaking. The man didn't stop. He walked right past her, past the fallen can, and continued toward a midnight blue 1971 Cadillac Eldorado parked in the shade of the store's overhang. The chrome gleamed like a promise, the white vinyl top spotless. He stopped beside the driver's door, leaned against it, and took another pull from his cigar. The woman finally managed to scoop up the can, clutching it against her chest with one hand while the bags threatened to spill from the other. She hurried toward the Cadillac, her sandals slapping against the hot pavement, and when she reached the trunk, she set the bags down on the bumper with a gasp that Sheriff Miller could hear even from 30 yards away. The man didn't move to help. He stood there, smoke curling around his face, sunglasses aimed at nothing in particular, waiting. Sheriff Miller's cigarette burned down to the filter. He crushed it in the ashtray, a dented tin thing that hadn't been emptied in weeks, and opened the door. The heat hit him like a fist, but he didn't pause. His boots crunched on the gravel as he crossed the lot, moving with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who'd learned that hurrying rarely solved anything. The woman was loading the bags into the trunk now, her hands shaking so badly that a box of corn flakes slipped and landed on the pavement. She bent to retrieve it, and that's when Sheriff Miller saw the bruise. It was on her left shoulder, just visible where the sleeve of her dress had slipped down. Purple-green, the kind that came from a hard grip, fingers pressed into flesh with intent. She adjusted the sleeve quickly, glancing sideways at the man, but he wasn't looking at her. He was looking at Sheriff Miller. The man straightened, pulled the cigar from his mouth, and offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Afternoon, officer." Sheriff Miller stopped a few feet away, thumbs hooked in his belt. He didn't return the smile. "Afternoon." The woman froze, the box of corn flakes clutched to her chest like a shield. Her eyes darted between the 2 men, wide and pale blue, the whites threaded with red. She looked like she wanted to disappear into the asphalt. "Hot enough for you?" the man said, chuckling. His voice was smooth, educated, the kind of voice that came from a college somewhere up north. "Feels like the whole damn valley's on fire." Sheriff Miller didn't respond. He let the silence stretch, watching the man's smile falter at the edges. "Well," the man said, clearing his throat, "we were just finishing up here. Long day, you know how it is." He gestured vaguely at the woman. "Margaret's been shopping all afternoon. Women, right? Can't leave a store without buying half of it." Margaret, the name landed in Sheriff Miller's mind like a stone dropping into still water. He looked at her. "That right, ma'am?" Her mouth opened, closed. She nodded too quickly. "Yes, sir." "Heavy load you got there." It's fine, I'm fine." Sheriff Miller's gaze drifted to her arms, to the red lines cutting across her skin, then to the man, still leaning against the Cadillac with his cigar like he didn't have a care in the world. "Looks like you could use a hand," Sheriff Miller said quietly. The man's smile returned, sharper now. "She's got it under control. Don't you, honey?" Margaret nodded again, faster this time. "Yes, I'm okay. Really." Sheriff Miller didn't move. He let his eyes linger on the man, taking in the expensive watch on his wrist, the gold ring on his finger, the soft hands that had never swung a hammer or turned a wrench. The kind of hands that signed checks and shook other men's hands in air-conditioned offices. "You from around here?" Sheriff Miller asked. The man's jaw tightened just a fraction. "Bakersfield, we're visiting Margaret's mother, just for the weekend." "That right?" "That's right." Sheriff Miller nodded slowly, then stepped past the man and walked to the trunk. Margaret flinched as he approached, but he didn't look at her. He picked up 2 of the remaining bags, they were heavier than they looked, cans and glass jars packed tight, and carried them to the trunk, setting them down with care. "Thank you," Margaret whispered, so quietly he almost didn't hear it. He straightened, met her eyes. They were the eyes of a woman who'd learned not to ask for help, who'd learned that asking only made things worse. "You take care, ma'am," he said. Then he turned and walked back to his patrol car, climbed inside, and sat. He didn't start the engine. He watched. The man opened the passenger door for Margaret, a performance, Sheriff Miller noted, executed only because he was being watched, and then walked around to the driver's side. He slid behind the wheel, started the engine with a roar that rattled the windows of the Piggly Wiggly, and backed out of the space. As the Cadillac rolled past the Dodge, the man gave Sheriff Miller a little salute, 2 fingers to his temple, the cigar still clamped between his teeth. Sheriff Miller didn't move. He watched the Cadillac turn onto Main Street, watched it disappear around the corner past the Texaco station, and then he reached for his radio. The handset crackled as he keyed the mic. "Dispatch, this is Miller." A woman's voice, nasal and bored, came through the static. "Go ahead, Sheriff." "Run a plate for me, California, Lincoln Charlie 7429, Midnight Blue Cadillac Eldorado." "Copy, stand by." He waited, lighting another cigarette. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows across the lot. A couple of kids rode past on bicycles, their laughter sharp and bright in the heavy air. The radio crackled again. "Sheriff, that plate comes back to a Lawrence Hartwell, address in Bakersfield, no wants or warrants." "Copy, thanks, Linda." He hung up the mic and sat back, exhaling smoke through his nose. Lawrence Hartwell. The name meant nothing to him, but that was fine. Names rarely mattered. What mattered was what a man did when he thought no one was watching. Sheriff Miller started the engine and pulled out of the lot, turning onto Main Street. He didn't have a plan, not yet. But he knew where the road to Bakersfield started, and he knew that men like Lawrence Hartwell always made a stop before they left town. They always wanted one more drink, one more cigar, one more chance to prove they were someone important. And Sheriff Miller was a patient man. He would wait, he would watch. And when Lawrence Hartwell made his mistake, because men like him always did, Sheriff Miller would be there. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. The tavern was called the Dusty Rose, though there wasn't anything rosy about it. It sat at the edge of town, where Main Street gave way to County Road, a squat cinderblock building with a neon sign that buzzed and flickered even in daylight. The parking lot was gravel and dust, dotted with pickup trucks and a few sedans that had seen better days. A jukebox inside played Hank Williams, the sound drifting out through the open door along with the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke. Sheriff Miller pulled into the lot and parked under the shade of an old oak tree, the only tree for miles that hadn't been bulldozed to make room for cotton fields. He killed the engine and waited. 15 minutes later, the midnight blue Cadillac rolled into the lot. Lawrence Hartwell parked near the entrance, in a spot clearly marked, reserved for owner. He climbed out, stretched, and tossed his cigar butt onto the gravel before walking inside. He didn't look around. Didn't notice the beige Dodge Polara sitting in the shade 30 yards away. Sheriff Miller waited another 5 minutes. Then he got out of the car, crossed the lot, and stepped into the cool darkness of the tavern. The interior was exactly what he expected. Dim lighting, a bar running the length of the left wall, booths along the right, a pool table in the back. A handful of locals sat scattered around, nursing beers and watching a baseball game on the small TV mounted above the bar. Lawrence Hartwell sat at the bar, a fresh whiskey in front of him, his sunglasses finally off and hooked on his shirt collar. He was talking to the bartender, a heavyset man named Frank who'd been pouring drinks in this valley since before Sheriff Miller was born. Frank was nodding politely, but his eyes had that glazed look that said he wasn't really listening. Sheriff Miller walked to the bar and took a seat 2 stools down from Lawrence. Frank looked up, recognized him, and nodded. "Sheriff, the usual?" "Just a Coke, Frank, thanks." Frank pulled a glass from the rack, filled it with ice, and poured from the soda gun. He slid it across the bar, and Sheriff Miller took a long drink, letting the cold cut through the heat that still clung to him. Lawrence glanced over, registered the uniform, and his jaw tightened. But he didn't say anything. He just turned back to his whiskey, swirling it in the glass like he was contemplating the meaning of life. Sheriff Miller set his glass down. "You make it to your mother-in-law's place yet?" Lawrence's hand froze mid-swirl. He turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Excuse me? Your mother-in-law," Sheriff Miller said. "You said you were visiting for the weekend. Just wondering if you made it there yet." Lawrence's eyes narrowed. "We're on our way, stopped for a drink first. Long drive. From the Piggly Wiggly to here is about 3 miles, Sheriff Miller said. That's a long drive? It's a free country, Lawrence said, his voice tight. I can stop wherever I want. Sure can, Sheriff Miller agreed. He took another sip of his Coke. Where's your wife? Lawrence's jaw clenched. In the car. In the car, Sheriff Miller repeated. In this heat. She's fine, air conditioning's running. Sheriff Miller nodded slowly. He glanced at Frank, who was wiping down the bar with studied disinterest, though his ears were clearly tuned to every word. Frank, you got a phone I can use? Sure thing, Sheriff, back by the restrooms. Sheriff Miller stood, tossed $1 on the bar, and walked toward the back. He didn't go to the phone. Instead, he stepped outside through the back door, circled around the building, and approached the Cadillac. The engine was running, the air conditioning humming. Margaret sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap, staring straight ahead. Sheriff Miller tapped on the window. She flinched, turned, and saw him. For a moment, she just stared, her eyes wide. Then she reached over and rolled down the window. Sheriff. You all right, ma'am? She nodded quickly, too quickly. Yes, I'm fine. You been sitting out here the whole time? Lawrence wanted a drink. He said it wouldn't be long. Sheriff Miller looked at her, really looked at her. The careful way she held herself, the way her hands trembled even though she was trying to keep them still, the way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. You want to come inside? He asked. Get out of the car for a bit? Frank makes a good lemonade. She glanced toward the tavern, her face paling. I don't think Lawrence would like that. I'm not asking Lawrence, Sheriff Miller said quietly. I'm asking you. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Then, slowly, she shook her head. I'm okay, really. Sheriff Miller reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a small card. He handed it through the window. This is the number for St. Mary's Church in Bakersfield. They've got a women's group. Good people. They help folks who need it. Margaret took the card, her hands shaking. I don't. You don't have to do anything with it, Sheriff Miller said. Just keep it, in case. She looked down at the card, then back at him. Her eyes were wet now, tears threatening to spill over. Thank you, she whispered. He nodded, stepped back, and walked back into the tavern. Lawrence was still at the bar, his whiskey glass empty. He was watching the door, his expression dark. Sheriff Miller sat back down on his stool, picked up his Coke. She's doing all right, he said. Glad to hear it, Lawrence said, his voice cold. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Lawrence stood, tossed a $5 bill on the bar, and turned to leave. "Have a safe trip," Sheriff Miller said. Lawrence stopped, turned back. "You know what your problem is, Sheriff." "What's that?" "You think you're some kind of hero, but you're just a small-town cop with too much time on his hands." Sheriff Miller smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "And you're a man who left his wife sitting in a hot parking lot while he had a drink. Guess we both got our problems." Lawrence's face flushed red. For a moment, Sheriff Miller thought he might take a swing, but then Lawrence turned and walked out, the door slamming behind him. Frank let out a low whistle. "That guy's a piece of work." "Yeah," Sheriff Miller said. "He is." He finished his Coke, stood, and walked to the window. He watched as Lawrence climbed into the Cadillac, slammed the door, and peeled out of the lot, gravel spraying behind the tires. And then, because Sheriff Miller was a patient man who understood that sometimes justice took a little creativity, he walked back to his patrol car, opened the trunk, and pulled out 4 brown paper bags. The same bags Margaret had been carrying. The ones she'd loaded into the Cadillac's trunk. He'd retrieved them while Lawrence was inside drinking. Quietly, carefully, and now he walked back into the tavern, set the bags on the bar, and looked at Frank. "You got a box I can use?" Frank grinned. "Sure do, Sheriff. What are you up to?" "Just evening the scales," Sheriff Miller said. 10 minutes later, Sheriff Miller was back on the road, following the same route the Cadillac had taken. He didn't hurry. He knew where Lawrence was going. There was only one road to Bakersfield from here, and it ran straight through 30 miles of farmland and nothing else. He found the Cadillac pulled over on the shoulder about 15 miles out, hazard lights blinking. Lawrence was standing beside the open trunk, staring at the empty space where the groceries should have been. His face was the color of a ripe tomato. Sheriff Miller pulled up behind the Cadillac, put on his own flashers, and stepped out. "Everything all right?" Lawrence spun around, his eyes wild. You did this." "Did what?" Sheriff Miller asked innocently. "The groceries, they're gone. You stole them." Sheriff Miller tilted his head. "That's a serious accusation, Mr. Hartwell. You got any proof?" Lawrence sputtered, his fists clenching and unclenching. "I know it was you. There's no one else." "You sure you loaded them?" Sheriff Miller asked. "Maybe you forgot. Happens when you're in a hurry." "I didn't forget." Lawrence stopped, his face going from red to purple. "You can't do this. This is theft. I'll have your badge. You'll what?" Sheriff Miller stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, even tone. "File a complaint? Go ahead. But when you do, I'm gonna tell them about how I saw you let your wife carry 4 heavy bags while you smoked a cigar. How I saw the bruises on her arms. How I saw her sitting in a hot car while you had a drink. And then I'm gonna suggest they ask Margaret if she wants to file a complaint of her own." Lawrence's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. You can't." "Here's what's gonna happen," Sheriff Miller said. "You're gonna walk back to town. It's 15 miles. Should take you about 4 hours in this heat. Margaret can drive the car. When you get back, the groceries will be waiting for you at the tavern. Frank's keeping them cold." Lawrence stared at him, disbelief written across his face. "You're insane. I'm not walking 15 miles. "Then I guess Margaret goes without groceries," Sheriff Miller said with a shrug. "Your call. This is illegal. You can't make me." "I'm not making you do anything," Sheriff Miller said. "I'm just giving you a choice. Walk back and get the groceries or drive on without them. Either way, Margaret's taking the wheel." He turned to the Cadillac, where Margaret sat in the passenger seat, watching through the window with wide eyes. "Ma'am, you know how to drive?" She nodded slowly. "Yes, sir." "Good. Your husband's gonna take a walk. You drive yourself to your mother's house. He'll catch up." Margaret looked at Lawrence, then back at Sheriff Miller. And then, for the first time since the grocery store, she smiled. It was small, tentative, but it was there. "Yes, sir," she said. Lawrence's face went through several shades of red and purple before landing on a kind of defeated gray. "You're making a mistake, Sheriff." "Maybe," Sheriff Miller said, "but it's mine to make." He walked back to his patrol car, climbed in, and started the engine. As he drove past the Cadillac, he saw Margaret sliding into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the wheel. And he saw Lawrence standing on the shoulder, staring after the patrol car with a look of pure rage. Sheriff Miller smiled. It wasn't the ending to the story, but it was a start. The sun was lower now, the heat finally starting to break. The asphalt shimmered less, the air growing almost breathable. And somewhere behind him, a man who'd never carried anything heavier than a briefcase was learning what it felt like to carry weight. By the time Lawrence Hartwell staggered back into town, the sun had set completely and the temperature had dropped to something almost pleasant. His shirt was soaked through with sweat, his expensive shoes covered in dust, and his face was the color of a brick. He limped into the parking lot of the Dusty Rose, where the Cadillac sat waiting, empty. Margaret was gone. The groceries were stacked neatly on the hood of Sheriff Miller's patrol car. Frank stood in the doorway of the tavern, arms crossed, watching. "Your wife called her mother," he said. "Got picked up about an hour ago. Said to tell you she'll see you at the house." Lawrence didn't respond. He just stood there, breathing hard, staring at the groceries. Sheriff Miller stepped out of the shadows near the oak tree. "Looks like you made it." Lawrence turned, his eyes blazing. "You son of a..." "Careful," Sheriff Miller said quietly. "You're about 2 seconds away from spending the night in a cell, and I don't think Margaret would bail you out." Lawrence's mouth snapped shut. He stood there, trembling with exhaustion and rage, and for a moment Sheriff Miller thought he might actually take a swing. But then Lawrence turned, grabbed the bags from the hood, and started walking toward the Cadillac. Sheriff Miller watched him load the groceries into the trunk, his movements stiff and angry. Watched him climb into the driver's seat. Watched him start the engine and pull out of the lot without a backward glance. Frank walked over, stood beside Sheriff Miller. "Think he learned anything?" Sheriff Miller lit a cigarette, the flame from his Zippo briefly illuminating his weathered face. "Maybe, maybe not, but Margaret learned something." "What's that?" "That she doesn't have to carry everything alone." Frank nodded, understanding passing between them without further words. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the taillights of the Cadillac disappear into the night. "You want that Coke now?" Frank asked. "On the house." "Thanks, Frank, but I think I'll head home. Long day." "Yeah," Frank said. "I bet." Sheriff Miller climbed back into his patrol car and sat for a moment, windows down, letting the cool evening air wash over him. He thought about Margaret, about the card he'd given her, about the smile she'd managed when she took the wheel. He thought about Lawrence, walking 15 miles in the heat, learning what it felt like to be burdened. And he thought about chains, the kind you could see and the kind you couldn't. Tomorrow, Lawrence would probably go back to being exactly who he was. But maybe, just maybe, Margaret would remember that she had options, that she had people who saw her, that she didn't have to stay invisible. Sheriff Miller started the engine and pulled out onto the empty highway, heading back toward town. The stars were out now, sharp and bright in the clear desert sky. The radio crackled with static and distant voices, other officers, other towns, other problems. But for tonight, his work was done. He'd done what he could. The rest was up to Margaret. The next afternoon, Sheriff Miller was back at his desk, filling out paperwork and trying to ignore the broken fan that wheezed pathetically in the corner when the phone rang. "Sheriff's office." "Sheriff Miller?" It was a man's voice, clipped and official. "This is Lieutenant Dawson, Bakersfield PD. I'm calling about an incident report filed by a Lawrence Hartwell. Says you stole groceries from his vehicle and forced him to walk 15 miles in the heat." Sheriff Miller leaned back in his chair, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "That right?" "That's what he says. Says you harassed him and his wife, made threats, abused your authority. Pretty serious allegations." "Well, Lieutenant, I'm happy to provide my account of events, but you might want to talk to Mrs. Hartwell first, get her side of the story." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "We tried. She declined to make a statement, said there was no incident." Sheriff Miller's smile widened. "Is that so?" "Yeah, Mr. Hartwell wasn't too happy about that. Got real agitated when we told him. We had to ask him to leave the station." "I see. Look, Sheriff, between you and me. Guy came in here acting like he owned the place, throwing around his job title, talking about lawyers. When his wife wouldn't back up his story, he changed his tune real quick. Started saying maybe he'd been mistaken, maybe the groceries fell out on the drive." "People make mistakes," Sheriff Miller said. "Heat can play tricks on you," Lieutenant Dawson chuckled. "Yeah, heat's a hell of a thing. Anyway, I'm closing the complaint as unfounded, but I wanted to give you a heads up in case he tries to escalate." "Appreciate it, Lieutenant. One more thing. Mrs. Hartwell called St. Mary's this morning. They're setting her up with a caseworker. Sheriff Miller closed his eyes, relief washing over him like cool water. That's good to hear. Yeah, thought you'd want to know. Whatever you did out there, Sheriff, it worked. They said their goodbyes and Sheriff Miller hung up the phone. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the ceiling fan as it wheezed and turned. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. Later that night, after the sun had finally set and the valley had cooled to something bearable, Sheriff Miller sat in his office at the station, filling out the day's reports. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the radio in the corner played low, some late-night talk show discussing the upcoming election. The phone on his desk rang. He picked it up. Sheriff's office. A woman's voice, hesitant and small. Sheriff Miller? Yes, ma'am. This is Margaret Hartwell from earlier today. He sat up straighter. Yes, ma'am, everything all right. There was a long pause. He could hear her breathing, could almost feel her gathering courage through the telephone line. I called that number, she said finally. St. Mary's, I'm going to talk to them tomorrow. Sheriff Miller closed his eyes, relief washing over him like cool water. That's good, Margaret, that's real good. I wanted to say thank you, she continued, her voice stronger now, for what you did today, for seeing me. You don't need to thank me. Yes, I do. Another pause. Lawrence, he took the chains off as soon as we crossed the county line, but I don't think he'll forget them, and I won't either. No, ma'am, Sheriff Miller said quietly. I don't reckon either of you will. They said their goodbyes, and he hung up the phone. For a long moment, he sat there in the quiet office, the smoke from his cigarette rising toward the stained ceiling tiles. Then he pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to write. There are chains we can see, iron and steel, wrapped around wrists, impossible to ignore. And then there are chains we cannot see, forged from words and silence, from years of being told you're not strong enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough to walk away. In the summer of 1973, in a valley where the heat could kill you if you weren't careful, a woman named Margaret learned that she didn't have to carry the weight alone. That there were hands willing to help, voices willing to speak up, doors willing to open. And a man named Lawrence learned that the world is full of sheriffs, men and women who won't look away, who won't let cruelty hide behind closed doors and expensive cars. If you're reading this and you see yourself in Margaret's story, know this: you are not alone, you are not weak. And the chains you wear, the ones nobody else can see, can be broken. Call someone, a church, a shelter, a friend, make the call, because the weight you're carrying wasn't meant to be carried alone. And somewhere out there, someone is waiting to help you set it down.